Hello again, and welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you fundamental principles and important tips regarding your understanding and practice of public speaking. In this lesson, we're going to look at the initial and very important piece of the process of invention in any public speaking situation, and that's selecting your topic. In some situations, you're not going to have latitude to do this because you'll be provided with a topic from an employer, from a teacher, or from somebody else who expects you to speak on a particular subject matter. But there are cases in which you'll have an opportunity to select your own topic, or at the very least, select a dimension of a predetermined topic that you can focus on. And so, in order to get a better understanding of this crucial part of the process, we're going to go to Chapter 6 of Frawley and Tuman's Speak Up, an Illustrated Guide to Public Speaking, to look at some important ideas. First, we'll discuss topic generation, how you determine the host of ideas that are possible, and then hone something down to a topic that you can use for your speech. Related to this, we'll talk about rhetorical purposes. In other words, we have to consider the relationship between the topic you want to speak on and the purposes for your speech. In other words, why are you delivering a speech in the first place? And finally, we'll consider the thesis statement, that all-important sentence in your introduction that boils down the most important idea in your speech, the main claim you want accepted for your audience. But first things first, we need to think about selecting general topics. And to do that, Frawley and Tuman suggest 4 primary steps: research, brainstorming, word association, and mind mapping. Let's briefly look at each in turn to see how they can contribute to the topic selection process. First, research. Sometimes this is a step that beginning public speakers forget about, thinking that they need to come up with something out of their own head. And this is where some folks can get really caught up. When you're given the latitude to select any topic you want to speak about, some of you may have had a similar relationship with an assignment where someone gives you an essay to write, and they say, write about anything you want. That can be a bit crippling, right? Because if you can't think of something on your own, you get stuck. So sometimes don't start on your own. Start by going to the library, browsing current periodicals, finding the magazines, the academic journals, and recently released books, and just take a snoop, right? This is a way in which the actual brick and mortar libraries have a bit of an advantage over a Google search. You can just sort of look around and see what kinds of things people are talking about in general areas of your interest. Related to this, you might think in particular about aiming for new topics that are less familiar to the audience. If you really want to make an impact on your listeners, chances are you don't want to select a topic that they may have heard a speech on a bunch of times in the past. If you give them something that they haven't really heard a lot about, that may give them reason to pay attention and to keep paying attention. So research is really key. The second idea is brainstorming, and this is where you go to your own vast inbuilt computer, your mind. So when we're talking about a brainstorm, we're talking about a list, a big list. Just get started throwing words on paper. What kinds of topics can you possibly think of? And when you're doing this kind of brainstorming, it's really important not to self-censor. Just because you're writing down a list and then all of a sudden you have an idea, I don't think that's a good idea. I shouldn't write that down. I should think of good ideas. And then that's kind of defeating the purpose of brainstorming. Just write stuff down. A lot of it is going to be poop, right? And some of it is going to be a good idea. So just write everything down. And one way that you can help yourself is to aim for topics that are familiar to you. Don't get too caught up with things like, what sort of topic is the professor going to like? Or what sort of topic is going to make me seem really smart and talented? You'll want to consider your audience, and we'll talk about that in just a bit, but your first step in your brainstorm is just, what are you into? What kinds of experiences have you had? What kinds of activities have you performed? What sort of subject matters you've studied? What kind of jobs you've had? What is the stuff that you're familiar with? Because chances are you're going to be better able to put together a coherent speech and be able to enthusiastically present it if you're talking about something that you know something about. The third idea for topic selection is word association. And you can imagine that if just regular brainstorming is a little bit tough for you, this is a primary step that you can take just to get the ball rolling. What you do with word association is to write a word and then the next word that comes to your mind. Sometimes what you just need to do is see what randomly happens when your brain sparks. So you write that word and then the next one that comes to your mind, again, without self-censoring, just whatever pops in there. There may be a really beautiful connection. There may be a really simple connection. There may be no connection whatsoever. Just go with it. Think of it as a brain barf. Write a word, then the next one that pops in your head, and then the next word, and then the next word, and then the next word. Just spew it out. And then what you'll find happening is the brainstorm is going to start providing some kind of pattern or some kind of ideas that you keep coming back to in the word association. And there might be something in a topic there for you. The final area of topic selection methods that can be really useful, and what I want to spend a little bit of time on, is mind mapping. Mind mapping involves some of the other methods that we were previously talking about, brainstorming, word association. What makes mind mapping cool is that it's a visual combination of these ideas. What you're doing is not just getting the ideas on paper, but as you do, you're going to illustrate the relationships and connections between ideas. The other neat thing about mind mapping is that you don't have to limit yourself to just words. You can do anything on a mind map that helps you visualize and structure the ideas and their relationships. So doodle, jot down little pictures, anything that can help out. What might this process look like? Let's give it a shot. Let's say that I'm interested in video games and I might want to do an informative speech on video games. Now the problem is that's a pretty broad topic, and if I leapt into a project the outcome of which was intended to be a 6-minute speech about video games, I couldn't do it. There's too much to talk about. You could write a 200-page doctoral dissertation on video games and still not capture everything. So what you need to do is start finding out what sort of ideas associate with that. So start branching off. Say I might think that, okay, there's different types of video games. Video games as an industry and as a cultural practice has a history, and I could talk about that. There are various different reasons we play video games. I can talk about the effects of video games. So I start with subtopics that branch off of the main idea out of my brainstorm, and then I just keep going. So let's say there's various types of video games that I brainstorm: sports, puzzles, action, first-person shooters, role-playing games, and any of these might possibly be a topic for a speech. So I could give a speech on the most popular types of video games that are currently out there, and I might have as the main points for that speech, say, sports games, first-person shooters, and action games might be the most popular types. You've got the core of a speech. Similarly, you might be able to drill down into these areas for an even more specific speech idea. So in the history of video games, let's say through my research and my brainstorming, I know that it got started in the 1970s. The golden age between the late 70s and the 1980s was an important period. There was a big rise in personal gaming in the 1990s, and then by the time we got to the 21st century, gaming had moved into mobile devices and cloud-based games on the internet. Each of these time periods might potentially have the basis for a good speech topic. There's lots of reasons we play video games: entertainment, relaxation, friends, learning, any of which might be a speech topic. How do we learn from video games? How do video games have a relationship to social interaction and making friends? When I think about the effects of video games, I know that there might be positive effects of video games, such as problem solving, coordination. There could be negative effects of video games, like aggression or online bullying. And this is just a partial mind map, right? You could keep going, branching off of any of these specific ideas in order to keep refining your brainstorm. And again, as I mentioned in this process, you don't have to just do it all in one sitting. You could start a mind map, go and do a little research and read to see what's going on with some of these subtopics and ideas and clusters within the map, and then use that as the basis for some further mind mapping and brainstorming. So this can be a really great process to generate specific ideas that are workable from the core of a really broad topic. Incidentally, besides applications for public speeches, this kind of mind mapping technique can be really helpful in everything from composing papers and essays to developing study guides for courses, to study for exams and such. So look into mind mapping. It's pretty cool. Okay, so if we have topics, one of the things you'll notice that we got out of a mind map was the importance of taking a broad topic and narrowing it to something that's doable. So Frawley and Tuman talk about a number of approaches that we can take if we want to narrow a topic. We should consider the assignment or the task. What sort of situation do we find ourselves in? What kind of speech is being expected? So, for instance, in many introductory public speaking classes, one of the first speaking assignments is an informative speech. And so you need to think about a topic that would be appropriate to select if what you need to do is teach the audience something or inform them about something they don't already know about. Consider your audience. One of the things that can be really helpful to any public speaker is being able to get immediate positive feedback from your listeners. And so if you select a topic or a dimension of a broader topic that you have a pretty good idea that your audience might really be interested in, that may be something you want to focus on. And of course, once you get into the process of audience analysis, that might actually help generate some ideas for you in the first place. But of course, considering your knowledge and interests is absolutely crucial. If you want to pick from a variety of different possible topics and you have the latitude to choose whatever you want, you really want to try to err on the side of speaking about something that you're interested in and you're enthusiastic about. What kinds of things are you really into that have given you certain experiences or certain insights or certain opportunities that other people don't have? You can take what you're really into and then find a way in which your audience potentially might find that interesting or important, and it's in that intersection you can have a really great speech topic. And then, of course, you want to consider as well the context of the speech. In other words, what other sorts of surrounding variables are going to be important. If you're delivering a speech in a classroom, you may end up selecting certain kinds of topics that would be very different if you were speaking before the Board of Education in your town, or if you were speaking before a large number of professors at your college or university. If you have a 6-minute time frame for your speech, that's going to mean that you can do certain topics. If you have a 20-minute to 40-minute lecture opportunity, there are things that you can do that you can't do in 6 minutes. So you need to think about these kinds of variables as well. And then once you decide on a topic that's going to be relevant for your assignment or task, your audience, your knowledge and interests, and the speech context, a really good rule of thumb is to pick that topic and then stick with it. One of the things that really gets many public speaking students hung up is that they start with an initial topic, they struggle with it a little bit in the research process or the process of coming up with main points, and they decide that discretion is the better part of valor and, okay, I'll dump this topic and I'll try something else. Remember that every time you change topics over the course of speech preparation, you're giving yourself less and less time to actually work on that topic and make the speech function well. So it's best if you pick a topic that you go with your gut, this is something that sounds really good, and then stick with it and make it work. Okay, so you have a topic, something that you want to talk about, but speeches aren't just about topics, they're about purposes. Public speaking is intended to accomplish something, and so you need to think about rhetorical purpose when you develop what it is you're going to talk about. When we talk about the general purpose of a speech, we're talking about your intended effect on the audience. What is it that the speech is, broadly speaking, supposed to do? Now, in many public speaking situations, you're going to find yourself working within one of 3 primary broad purposes: informing your audience, persuading your audience, or celebrating or commemorating with your audience during a special occasion. And so these are general purposes for a speech, and it may seem kind of simplistic to identify and write down on paper, my general purpose is to inform my audience. But that's an important thing to not leave out, because once you know that your focus is on informing as opposed to persuading, for instance, that's going to mean that certain kinds of strategies for what you say and how you say it are going to be highlighted. You're going to do certain things in an informative speech that you might not necessarily do in a special occasion speech. You're going to do certain things if you're trying to persuade your audience that you really wouldn't do in a speech where what you're really trying to do is just inform them or teach them. So you need to think about the intended effect on your audience. From general purpose, we move to specific purpose, and that's really the primary objective of your speech. So if your general purpose is to inform, the specific purpose is to inform them about what? If your general purpose is to persuade, then your specific purpose is to persuade them what? So really considering the objective. So notice that this is much more specific than just the topic. I am going to talk about this. We don't just want to talk about things. We want to try to accomplish things, specifically effects on our audience. When you think about how to compose a specific purpose, this formula is pretty easy. Take your general purpose, add to it your narrowed topic, the focus that you want to have, and the intent. In other words, what is it that you're really driving at? So, for instance, let's take this example. I'm a gamer. I enjoy playing home video games. It's something that really interests me. I've done a lot of gaming, and it's something that I know a bit about. And after doing some research and some brainstorming and mind mapping, I come to realize that I really want to look at the history of video games. I came of age in the 1980s, and the release of the Atari 2600 in the late 70s, early 80s was a seminal moment in the history of video games, and it launched part of the golden age of video gaming, along with video arcades and malls and such. But then as I continued to do my research, I was then thinking about past experience and realized that something really interesting happened. Around 1983, there was a huge crash in the video game industry because the market was oversaturated with a lot of really junky products. The Atari 2600 goes under, and a lot of American video game companies start going bankrupt and not doing much. And then a few years later, something interesting happens, especially for the onset Nintendo with their Nintendo Entertainment System, and then their Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and then moving to other Japanese companies such as Sega with their Genesis, and ultimately Sony with their PlayStation. The whole center of gravity in home video gaming shifted from American companies like Atari to Japanese companies like Nintendo and Sega and Sony, whereas the American companies were just sort of going away. Now that's a really interesting idea for informative speech topics. So how do I get there? Okay, so I have to think about rhetorical purpose. My topic, the history of video games, and my general purpose is to inform. The narrowed topic that I came up with is not just the history of video games, but early home video gaming, and particularly the video game crash of 1983 and its aftermath. My intent, what I want to try to do with the speech, is to explain why Japanese companies came to dominate home video games. How did that happen? And so ultimately, I come up with this as my specific purpose, to inform my audience why the video game crash of 1983 led to the domination of the home video game industry by Japanese companies. Now, compare that kind of specific purpose to a statement like this. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the history of video games. You can see the difference, right? What I've got here for a specific purpose is much more concrete, it's much more focused, and I have an intent and an objective, which is going to drive the kinds of information I provide, the kinds of points that I want to make, and so forth. So moving from a general topic to a specific rhetorical purpose is absolutely crucial. So once we have our specific rhetorical purpose, one of the final steps we're going to take to really nail down what my audience is going to get out of my speech is the thesis statement. A thesis, as many of you are probably going to remember from paper writing class, is a single sentence that captures the overall message you want to convey in your speech. Frowley and Tuman go on to describe a thesis this way. The thesis is the bottom line of your speech, the ultimate message that all the points in your speech support. So, ultimately, what you want to be able to do is move beyond a vague topic like the history of video games, and you want to boil down into a single sentence. Basically this: if your audience forgets everything else that you said over the course of a 5 to 7 minute speech, what is the one sentence you want them to remember? What is the one key idea that, if they understand that at the end of your speech, you've done your job? That's what a thesis is. So, if you're coming up with a thesis statement, there are a couple of big don'ts you ought to keep in mind. First of all, don't ignore your specific rhetorical purpose. The thesis is not separate from this. If you have a specific intent, something that you want to inform your audience about, that specific purpose needs to drive what the thesis is about. If your thesis doesn't have a connection to your specific rhetorical purpose, then you've got the wrong thesis. Another big don't is don't construct a thesis until you've started the invention process. Now, I'm about to tell you that in many cases, your high school sophomore English teacher teaching you how to write the 5-paragraph essay was probably wrong. How many of you remember something like this? Wants your essay to be coherent and backed by research. Makes you write your thesis before doing your research. Now, it's very typical, and this is something a lot of us have learned when we're writing papers or doing speeches. You figure out what your thesis is, and then you develop main ideas and supporting material that are going to back up your thesis. Now, this is partially a good idea, but the problem is if you come up with a thesis before you actually start doing some research, it does two things. First of all, it restricts your research. You end up discarding potentially important research information because it doesn't have a direct connection to the very narrow thesis that you've already come up with. The other thing that can happen is that by the time you're finished writing the essay or by the time you're finished writing the outline of your speech, it turns out that your essay or your speech is actually about something that's a little bit different than the thesis you came up in the first place. So what sometimes happens then is one version of a thesis is presented in the introduction of the paper or the speech, and then by the time we get to the conclusion of that paper or that speech, the thesis is really something different. And that's weird, right? The other thing that sometimes happens along these lines is the thesis is utterly neglected at the beginning of the process because we don't know what this is about. But by the time we get to the end of our draft of the paper or the speech, that's when we know what the paper or the speech is about, and that's when we write our thesis. But the audience won't find out what the thesis is until the end of the essay or the end of the speech. And remember, this isn't a mystery novel. This is a speech to inform, right? So, how do we really want to go about this? Well, you want to start content research as you're doing your brainstorming and your mind mapping and figuring out your purpose. These processes need to be back and forth, hand in hand, because once you start doing research and then you start developing the main points for your speech, what are the big ideas that you want to talk about? Once you've got some of that work done, then you're going to have a better sense of answering the question, what is this speech really about? So the short version of this is, first, don't ignore your specific rhetorical purpose. If there's something you want to do in this speech, you have to take that into account when you frame a thesis. And the other aspect of this, don't write a thesis until you know what the speech is about. Figure out what you're going to talk about, and then frame a thesis that crystallizes that into one clear, direct sentence that sums everything up. Okay. So think about my specific purpose from the speech that I've been working on in this video example. I want to inform my audience why the video game crash of 1983 led to the domination of the home video game industry by Japanese companies. As I do my research and I find what my main points are going to be and I refine things, I might end up with a thesis like this. The video game crash of 1983 shifted the balance of power in the home video game industry from the United States to Japan. So that statement is going to be the main claim that I'm going to make as I inform my audience about this bit of history, and then everything I do in the main points of the speech is going to support this larger thesis statement. And so in this case, as you can see, the specific purpose and the thesis statement are really pretty close. But the difference is the specific purpose says, this is what I want to do in the speech. That's a statement for you, the speaker. The thesis states, this is the main point of my speech I'm making today. This is a statement for the audience. This is the one thing you want them to remember. Okay, so to sum things up, when selecting your speech topic, you want to think about the primary importance of topic generation, rhetorical purposes, and your thesis statement. When you consider topic generation, remember you have to think about the situation you're in as a public speaker. You want to take your audience and their interests and knowledge into consideration. And of course, the primary variable is you. What do you know? What are you interested in? What kinds of topics are something that you could speak confidently and enthusiastically about? Considering rhetorical purposes, we want to think about the general purpose. Are we informing? Are we persuading? Are we celebrating a special occasion? And then we ultimately want to develop a specific rhetorical purpose. What is the direct outcome? What is the objective that I have for my audience? What kind of effect do I want to have on them in particular? And finally, after you continue the invention process through research and developing your main points, you'll be in a position to ultimately have a thesis statement. That one sentence main point of the whole speech that advances your specific rhetorical purposes. Okay, so if you've got any questions at all about this process or ways that you can engage any of these specific methods or strategies, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.